Okay, let's dive into this. We've got some really, really fascinating material here from Mookie Tenenbaum.
Right, who, as you know, is a lawyer and a pretty well-known geopolitical analyst.
Exactly. And the topic he's tackling is, well, it's incredibly sensitive. The health of a president, how information gets managed, or perhaps mismanaged.
Mm-hmm.
So this deep dive is all about pulling out the key insights from Tenenbaum's analysis on this specific recent case. We're looking at the facts as he presents them and, crucially, what he sees as the potential implications.
Right, and Tenenbaum's core argument really is about this apparent gap he identifies, a disconnect between the president's alleged health condition and, well, the official story being told.
And the consequences of that gap.
Precisely. For governance, for transparency, accountability. It touches on some big themes based on his analysis. So our mission here is to really get clear on Tenenbaum's claims, understand the information he's using, and unpack the potential fallout he discusses.
Okay, so let's jump right in. According to Tenenbaum, what was the initial health news that sort of kicked off this line of inquiry for him? What diagnosis does he focus on?
He zooms in on the diagnosis that came out, prostate cancer, but specifically with bone metastasis.
Okay.
And he characterizes the scale of that pretty starkly. A 9 out of 10, he says, which in his assessment means it's very, very serious. A bad situation.
And Tenenbaum makes a pretty striking point about the timing of this diagnosis, doesn't he?
He does. This is really central for him. He finds it significant that this cancer apparently seems to be over 10 years old.
10 years?
Yeah. And he argues, look, given that time frame, it seems highly improbable to think that this wasn't known much, much earlier.
Especially wasn't there a prior issue?
Exactly. He points to a previous diagnosis of an enlarged prostate, fully 14 years before this cancer diagnosis came to light. He also throws in a quick bit of context. Prostate's role making seminal fluid and just reminding people that prostate cancer is actually the most common cancer in men worldwide. Just background info he includes.
Right, setting the stage. But then Tenenbaum makes a connection that's maybe less obvious. He asks, okay, if prostate cancer itself doesn't typically cause dementia, where does this concern about the president's mental state, which he discusses, actually come from?
Yes, and this is really a critical piece of his analysis. Tenenbaum argues that it's not the cancer directly, but the treatment for it, specifically testosterone deprivation therapy.
Yeah, but treatment.
That's his point. He says this kind of treatment can cause dementia, particularly in men over 70. And he mentions other side effects he links to it, things like muscle weakness, which, could explain some falls.
Okay, I see the link he's drawing.
So Tenenbaum's major claim here is, if they knew about this serious cancer, they were almost certainly administering this treatment. And it was that treatment, he argues, which caused, or at the very least significantly worsened the dementia he alleges.
So the crucial insight he's presenting isn't just the illness, but the therapy for it potentially driving cognitive issues in older men. That feels absolutely central to his argument. And he then points out, look, concerns about the president's state, well, they aren't exactly brand new.
That's right. He brings up those past observations, times the president seemed maybe out of it. And he knows how those were often explained the way he was looking at a pigeon or something similar.
I remember those instances being reported.
But Tenenbaum's claim is that the underlying situation, the mental state, was already poor much earlier. He points back to 2016 and especially 2019.
What does he cite from them?
He specifically references articles published in Politico back in 2019. And he makes a point of describing Politico as generally a pro-Democrat outlet.
Okay.
And according to Tenenbaum, these articles allegedly detail things like disorientation and this interesting pattern of having better recall for distant past events compared to more recent ones. So he connects this history, suggesting it lends weight to his view that Trump's old nickname, Sleepy Joe, wasn't just politics, but, in Tenenbaum's words, actually accurate.
Okay, so given these alleged health issues, both the cancer treatment side effects and these earlier observations, Tenenbaum discusses how does he then describe the way information might be managed or even perhaps controlled within the White House itself. What's the structure he points to?
Well, he emphasizes a key structural aspect of the White House, the physical and operational separation between the East Wing, which is the residence, and the West Wing, the offices.
Right, living versus working space.
Exactly. And his point is, access to the president when he's in the East Wing is actually very restricted. You're basically talking about his wife, maybe a personal valet, and the Secret Service detail.
And the Secret Service, Tenenbaum mentions their role.
Yes, he reminds us they have two main jobs, protection, obviously, but also dealing with counterfeiting. And crucially, he stresses they operate under a very strict code of silence. That silence, he suggests, is significant in this context.
And then COVID enters the picture. How does Tenenbaum incorporate that into his analysis of isolation?
Yeah, he argues that the pandemic, quite conveniently perhaps, provided a perfect pretext to isolate the president even more. Particularly, he says, when the president was spending time in Wilmington, Delaware.
Wait.
For what Tenenbaum claims was a period of about 2 years, this situation allegedly cut down the number of advisors with daily face-to-face access to a tiny circle, maybe just 6 or 7 people.
Wow, that's a small group for running the country. This leads then to one of Tenenbaum's most specific and maybe controversial points, something that could offer a glimpse into the operational reality he's describing. It involves the autopen. Now, we know presidents use autopens, right, for signing lots of documents.
Of course, standard practice for high volume.
Yeah.
But here's Tenenbaum's really striking claim. He alleges that the autopen system was used to sign far more documents than would normally be the case.
Why? What's his reasoning?
He alleges it was because the president was, at times, actually unable to physically sign documents himself, or perhaps even unable to read and fully comprehend the material he was supposed to be signing.
That's a huge claim.
It is. And based on this, Tenenbaum puts forward the view that effectively the country was being managed during these alleged periods by the First Lady and that very small inner circle of advisors.
Does Tenenbaum offer any specific examples of what he sees as the consequences of this alleged situation, where nobody was in charge, so to speak?
He does give one very concrete example.
Yeah.
He points to the president's initial executive order aimed at stopping illegal immigration.
Okay.
Tenenbaum's claim is that this order was issued, but then essentially forgotten by the president himself. And the result, according to Tenenbaum's analysis, was that nothing was effectively done, leading, he says, to some 14 million illegal entries because, in his assessment, nobody was in charge on that specific issue.
Okay. Tenenbaum also suggests that signs of the president's condition weren't just visible internally or noticed domestically. He argues they were noticed abroad, too.
Yes, that's another layer he adds. He brings up the fact that Russian state television was apparently reporting that the president was unwell way back in 2020.
Which, at the time,
right, was immediately dismissed in the West as Russian disinformation. Standard procedure, perhaps?
But Tenenbaum sees it differently now.
Well, he recounts this interesting anecdote. He says he asked an AI system about foreign leaders noticing the president's state. And according to him, the AI confirmed that this original Russian report is now actually considered true data by some systems. But, paradoxically, it's still often flagged or tagged as disinformation. It's a peculiar situation, he highlights. And beyond that specific report, Tenenbaum basically argues it's just common sense. He finds it implausible that sophisticated foreign leaders attending G7 or G20 summits wouldn't have picked up on the situation themselves over time.
Okay, so if Tenenbaum's analysis lays out this picture, the alleged health issues, the treatment effects, the isolation, the autopen use, the foreign observations, what does he see as the potential fallout, legally, politically? This feels like where his analysis gets really serious.
It really does. This is where Tenenbaum digs into the potential consequences, and they are potentially massive, according to his view. He starts talking about the possible invalidity of official actions taken during periods when the president was allegedly incapacitated. He uses the Spanish term apagado, sort of meaning switched off or out of it.
Invalidity of actions. What sort of actions does he suggest could be questioned?
He gives some very specific examples. Tenenbaum points directly to things like presidential pardons, amnesties, or clemencies that were granted.
Including for whom?
Including, he notes, for the president's son, Hunter, and also for some former employees. Tenenbaum suggests these actions could potentially be challenged and even reversed if the signature or the decision-making capacity behind it is deemed legally invalid.
Wow. And beyond just reversing actions.
Well, he also raises potential legal jeopardy for the people around the president. Anyone who allegedly had him sign documents or who authorized the use of the autopen while knowing he was supposedly incapacitated. Tenenbaum frames this potential offense as falsity before official bodies.
Okay.
And he connects this directly to the findings in the special counsel Robert Hur report, the one about the classified documents.
Right, I remember that report.
Tenenbaum highlights Hur's conclusion that the president lacked the mental capacity to stand trial. For Tenenbaum, this official assessment strongly bolsters the questions he's raising about the president's capacity to understand and validly sign complex legal documents or executive orders during that same time frame.
That certainly broadens the scope beyond just health privacy. So digging deeper into this accountability angle, who specifically does Tenenbaum suggest might be implicated? Who, in his analysis, knew what was allegedly going on?
He argues it's primarily those who witnessed the situation firsthand and either actively participated in decisions or directives, or perhaps remained silent when they had a duty to act.
Does he name names or groups?
He does provide a list based on his analysis of who would have likely known or been involved.
Yeah.
He points to the First Lady, Jill Biden. He points to the son, Hunter Biden, and Tenenbaum specifically brings up Hunter's documented past issues, like crack use, his Ukraine business dealings, the tax conviction, perhaps suggesting context for potential influence, or even, he speculates, use of the auto pen.
Okay, who else?
The Vice President, Kamala Harris. Tenenbaum notes her regular weekly lunches with the president, suggesting she would have had visibility. He even posits she might face a difficult choice down the line: testify, or perhaps invoke the Fifth Amendment, which he suggests could have career-ending implications for her.
That's stark.
And then, beyond the family and VP, he includes cabinet members and key White House senior staff. But Tenenbaum emphasizes his focus isn't necessarily on lower-level staff just keeping quiet. It's more on those who held significant positions of responsibility and allegedly acted or directed actions, knowing the president's supposed condition.
To give this some context, Tenenbaum also looks at history, doesn't he? He draws some parallels.
Yes, he does. He brings up the case of the French president, François Mitterrand.
Who had cancer.
Right. Mitterrand secretly battled cancer for years while in office. Tenenbaum talks about Mitterrand's personal physician, Dr. Gobler, who revealed this truth after Mitterrand's death in a book called Le Grand Secret, The Grand Secret.
And what happened to the doctor?
According to Tenenbaum's account, the doctor was initially arrested. The book was banned in France. A huge scandal. But eventually, the doctor was vindicated by the European Court of Human Rights on grounds of free expression.
And Tenenbaum contrasts this with the U.S.
Exactly. He uses it to highlight the difference between France's stricter laws around professional secrecy and the very broad protections offered by the U.S. First Amendment, which he argues would likely shield someone revealing similar information about a U.S. president's health.
And he ties this historical and legal context back to a specific, critical part of the U.S. system.
Absolutely. He puts a really strong emphasis on the 25th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution,
which deals with presidential incapacity.
Right. But Tenenbaum stresses he doesn't see it as just an option or a right. He interprets the 25th Amendment as imposing a positive obligation, a constitutional duty on a vice president and a majority of the cabinet to remove a president temporarily or permanently if they deem him unfit to discharge the powers and duties of the office.
And he provides historical context for why that amendment exists.
Yes. He points back to situations like the end of Franklin D. Roosevelt's presidency, where FDR was allegedly, in Tenenbaum's word, gone, mentally and physically, in his final months. And also the earlier case of Woodrow Wilson, who suffered a debilitating stroke, after which his wife, Edith Wilson, effectively ran the government in secret.
So Tenenbaum's argument is that the 25th Amendment was created for exactly this kind of scenario.
And that in this recent case, according to his analysis, the cabinet members had a constitutional responsibility that they allegedly failed to uphold.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. Does Tenenbaum frame all of this as some kind of coordinated conspiracy? How does he explain so many people potentially being involved or staying silent?
Interestingly, no. He doesn't really lean heavily on the idea of a formal planned conspiracy. He thinks that would be too complex, too many people involved, too hard to keep secret.
So what's his alternative explanation?
He suggests it was more likely what he calls a convergence of interests. Lots of different people, perhaps acting somewhat independently, but whose interests aligned in keeping the situation quiet and maintaining the status quo.
What kind of interests?
Things like basic job security for staffers and officials, maybe ideological reasons preferring the current situation, even with an allegedly impaired president, whom he describes using the Spanish word monogote, meaning puppet or figurehead, over the alternatives, like a return of Donald Trump. So individual motivations aligning rather than a grand plot.
And looking forward, what does Tenenbaum predict? Does he think this story is over?
Quite the opposite. He states very clearly his belief that this scandal, as he sees it, is just starting. He even suggests it has the potential to become much, much bigger than the Watergate scandal.
If ever done Watergate, that's a bold claim. What does he see happening next?
He talks about the possibility of serious investigations. He mentions potential inquiries from the House of Representatives, maybe the Senate. He even floats the idea that a special prosecutor might eventually need to be appointed to look into it all.
And what could those investigations uncover or lead to, in his view?
Well, Tenenbaum outlines several potential actions, definitely a review of those pardons, clemencies, and amnesties he mentioned earlier.
Okay.
Possibly, he suggests, even a review of judicial appointments made during the period in question, which he notes could become political leverage, say, for someone like Trump, if he were to return to office.
Right.
And then the really big one, potentially questioning the validity of actual laws passed or treaties signed during this time. Though Tenenbaum acknowledges that path leads into extremely complex territory, what he calls a potentially serious constitutional problem.
It certainly sounds like the scale of what Tenenbaum is describing, the potential legal chaos, the political implications, is just immense.
It really is. The picture Tenenbaum paints is of a major world power potentially being run for a significant period without a fully mentally capable leader at the helm.
And the foreign policy angle he raised.
Right, the implication that other nations, adversaries perhaps, might have perceived this alleged weakness and sought to take advantage of the situation. It adds another whole dimension.
So his overall assessment is pretty stark.
Extremely. He makes the very strong claim that, in his view, this situation is not comparable to anything else in American history, simply because of the potential scale of what was allegedly concealed, or what decisions were not made or were made improperly.
So ultimately, Tenenbaum's analysis really forces us back to that fundamental tension, doesn't it? The conflict between a leader's right to personal medical privacy and the public's absolute need to know about their president's capacity to actually govern.
Exactly. It's incredibly complex. His analysis points towards potential layers of accountability or lack thereof involving individuals very close to the president, extending perhaps to cabinet officials and their specific duties under the Constitution, like the 25th Amendment he focused on.
So the final thought we want to leave you with, drawing from Tenenbaum's perspective here, is this. If, and it's a big if based on his analysis, but if significant decisions, laws, pardons, appointments were potentially made or signed off on by someone who might not have been able to fully understand their weight or implications, what does that truly mean? What does it say about the legitimacy of those actions, and perhaps more importantly, about the effectiveness of the constitutional safeguards designed precisely to prevent such a scenario? Definitely something to mull over.